So it seems like it would be a good thing to, ask you to introduce the notion of Civium to the kind of interested party that might not have heard you discuss it before, but is distinctly aware that we need to build differently. Things are changing. And it's the kind of person that likes to consider themselves, well, I'm ready for change, and I'm willing to, and actually I have the means to participate in some form. I'm willing to put in the time to understand. I'm interested in coming into a quality interaction, interested to participate
so I'll give it a
ethically
shot.
in that, please.
So the way I think I maybe will begin is something like at the level of design, perhaps even just a bit of a critique. So we've endeavored, we meaning humanity, have endeavored, of course, many times to reinvent the way that we congregate, the way that we live together. And in the past several centuries have done so in ways that are endeavoring to do it in a way that is, I would say, conscious or intentional, right? Thoughtful, as opposed to merely functional, which has was the order of the day for a long period of time. And what I would say is different about the notion of Civium is that the design intent came from the very beginning with a proposition that the problem that we're trying to deal with is, well, let me just begin by saying rather deep. And it's maybe the problem of civilization itself. So we're not just trying to figure out how to create sort of a nice place to live, for example, or even a place that is ecologically sound, because there's an awareness of the implications and complications of the total set of things that we do under the heading of civilization that need to be considered, and that the effort or the best intentions will tend to be unraveled or will fail, or sometimes even create negative consequences in a very micro case if you don't actually think about the global case as well. So that's maybe in the very beginning. Is there a way to put your arms around it where the strength of your design is adequate to something that actually shifts the underlying basis of the deeper problem, which I'll just right now call the problem of civilization. In other language, I will call it the problem of game. And therefore is, at least in principle, able to address that set of problems effectively and create something which is enduring. Now, it's really interesting that in the past 6 months, I've been exposed to the work of one of your, somebody who lives near you, I think, actually, Tyson Yunkaporta, because he, coming from a rather different direction, ended up coming to some very similar conclusions, and I might be using some of his ideas. So the first is the proposition that, in fact, in many ways, the problem of civilization is also the problem of city, that it may in fact be appropriate to say that all civilizations are merely the sort of actuation adjunct of cities. And so whether you're talking about Roman Empire, or you're talking about the British Empire, or talking about the American Empire, or I suppose you can go backwards and talk about the city-states of Greece. In each case, the extended territory, as significant as it was, may in fact be properly seen as being something like the circulatory system of the city, which was at the essence of it. And the network of cities, by the way. And this is based, from my point of view, largely on the work of Geoffrey West and Louis Betancourt, which popularized in the book Scale. So that's a very, very interesting notion. And the next question would be, okay, why? And more specifically, what kinds of changes would be the adequate changes to shift that? And here again, Tyson, I think, hits the nail on the head when he makes a distinction between what he calls growth and increase. So here, the notion is that, well, again, West and Betancourt, they noticed that cities have a unique scaling characteristic, which is to say that as a city grows, certain metrics, like, say, for example, wealth per capita, grow in a very unusual way. Generally speaking, in nature, what we see is that when an organism, and that might include, say, like an ecosystem like a forest, or a part of what we might consider an organism like a cell, as the organism grows, most of the relevant characteristics grow on what's called a sublinear scaling. So what this means is, for example, if I take a mouse and I look at the rate of metabolism per unit mass, meaning how much energy is cycling through the organism for the total mass in grams. If I increase the mass, the actual metabolism only increases at about 85%. So if I double the mass, instead of the metabolism doubling, it only increases by 85%, which is to say that there's a certain efficiency built in, and also certain limitations to scale built in to biological organisms. And this is common across all living organisms, and in fact, common across human organisms as well. Like corporations have a similar scaling factor. If I double the number of employees in a company, I actually don't double the revenue per employee. It tends to decrease per employee. But cities behave differently. Betancourt and West discovered that they actually increase superlinearly, which is to say, if I double the size of a city, and by the way, in some sense, hold everything else constant, I will actually get a 115% increase of the wealth per capita, or income per capita, if you prefer. Now, that's actually a super, super powerful discovery. And one of the characteristics, so now I'm kind of going off on my own. What's that called? I'm walking my own plank now. So what I would propose is that this makes the city a certain kind of growth attractor. What the city has been trying to do throughout history, since we discovered the construct of the city, has been to grow, to put as many people as possible in the city as it can get. And sort of every problem context of cities, and therefore every problem context of civilizations that are attached to them, has to do with the constraints on that ability. So, for example, if I put, say, 1 million people in a city, I have to feed 1 million people. And if the only way that I can feed people is by hauling wheat in on people's shoulders in bags, I can't pull that off very easily. That's hard to do, more or less impossible. So I have to do things like invent roads or invent barges. Right? So there's a relationship between, on the one hand, the physical constraints that are associated with squeezing human bodies into physical space, in terms of largely energy coming in and waste going out, but also what they need to do other things like meet other people and move around in the space, transportation and whatnot. The technological capacity of the environment that we're in, and then the limitations to scale that are possible, right? And so effectively every city is trying to solve that problem. And what West and Betancourt found was that there was a moment where the city would tend to grow up to the limits of the existing technology. But remember, because as cities grow, the actual certain characteristics increase superlinearly. Well, one of those characteristics is actually innovation. So as the cities would grow in population, the innovation of that particular city, and therefore that civilization, would actually tend to also go superlinearly. So you would get these explosions of innovation, which would tend to cluster around constraints to growth. And so you would tend to get these step functions where they'd actually pulse. And then, of course, you'd get things that were much, much larger than had previously existed in the world around them, like the first cities, Ur and Akkad and places like that. Until eventually they do peter out and something happens which limits their capacity to grow. Whoops, I lost you. Are we okay?
Yeah, keep going. I'm here.
So this sort of mammon desire to grow at all costs, and the kind of the imperial organization of all space, and to some extent all time, as a subsidiary function to feed the growth of the city, is a really interesting way of thinking about what's the problem of civilization. Everything ultimately becomes a feedstock. Every small town exists largely as a consequence of its context in the relationship to the capacity of it to serve as a way of feeding the growth of the city, all the way up the chain to the largest cities and ultimately, I guess, megalopolises and conurbations that are now dominate our landscape. Okay. So then what Tyson does is he presents an alternative, and here he specifically presents an alternative that was real in the context of the indigenous human groups, which he calls increase. And I love his metaphor, actually. He says, okay, if I want to increase or improve, let's just go with a very simple metric, IQ in a human. Broadly speaking, there's two things I might do. I could grow the number of neurons. I could just make it a larger brain. I could take a brain that weighs 10 kilograms and make it a brain that weighs 15 kilograms. Or I could increase the quality of the brain. I could increase not just the number of neural connections, the synapses inside, but also the quality, which ones specifically are networking with which ones, right? The network topology. What I love about that metaphor is that it's real. Right? Human beings actually ran into a limit on how rapidly or how big we could get our brains because of the birth canal. And so we ran into that limit. Evolution was forced to find a way to continue to increase our cognitive capacities by virtue of increase, meaning if you think about development, these processes of development where the brain will actually create a huge number of connections, then prune the hell out of them, then increase again, all focusing on not more neurons, but on better connections. Okay, well, that's nice. That's a move, right? So the move is to say, okay, we need to find a way to move away from growth as a mandate and move towards increase as a mandate. So that's one key premise of Civium, right? First key premise is we need to find a way to move away from the city and all the characteristics that make the city the city. And the second is, all right, one of those characteristics is this notion of growth, and the thing that is the right thing is increase, quality of relationships specifically. And you can think about that quite practically. And if I'm moving into a city from a small town, and I'm moving into a city of, say, 1 million people, how big is Melbourne?
I think about 3 million-ish, give or take a million.
Right. So I'm moving from a town of about a small city of 150,000, and I move to Melbourne. Part of the point, part of the attraction is there's just a much larger potential of relationships. There's the likelihood that I will be able to find people who are high quality relationships for me. They have similar tastes or interests or whatever. It's just a lot larger, right? By, in this case, 2 orders of magnitude. Okay, that's true. But it also has a real problem, which is, well, there's 3 million fucking people. And the reality is you're only ever going to meet a small fraction of them, and only ever going to be in a relationship with an even smaller fraction. So beyond a certain small number, which is around 150,000 people or so, the bigger problem is actually search. It's not mass, right? You don't actually need, think about like the internet. The internet is vast. I don't need to have a bigger internet. What I need to have is a better way of finding the aspects of the internet that are relevant to me. And by the way, now. So that's another piece, right? When we start thinking about increase, we start thinking about quality. And we start thinking about, oh, okay, well, the move is to say, how do I move away from just adding more nodes to the graph and move towards getting better and better and better at finding the right relationships? Okay, well, when I look at the right relationships, it seems there's 3 primary characteristics. One is who. So that's the easiest, right? Like right now, should I be talking to you right now, or should I be talking to someone else? The second is what, right? As we began the conversation, there's a very large number of possible things that we could have in our relationship, and being able to orient on that what quickly and well is a thing. And then in some sense, how, and how largely has to do with the skillfulness on both of our parts to enter into relationship, how deeply, fully, how intimately, how sustainably, how resiliently, how anti-fragile can we actually make the relationship itself. In some sense, that's that, right? So then we make another move. And I think that's probably, well, I'll stop for a moment. Okay. No, I'm going to break that promise. I've got things are pouring in from the back of my head right now. So the next move is an insight that I had recently, and I think it's right. So I'll put it out there. I've already put it in a video, but I'll put it here as well. One of the things that has been constraining the possibility of Civium up until very recently is the obligate binding of the virtual with the physical. So when I look at that superlinear scaling, and I look at it very closely, this notion of trying to squeeze as many bodies into the same space as possible, what I notice is that the thing that's really looking to be connected is not bodies, it's minds. Right? The real thing that is actually driving growth is minds, more minds. Metcalfe's law specifically. It's communication is the governing protocol. And the reason why cities are cities is because up until very recently, the only way we could communicate was to be in person. And even still relatively until, like, I guess we had COVID, the bandwidth of communication, right, interpersonal and embodied communication still radically dwarfed the bandwidth of telecommunication. But take the clock back 250 years, and it was obvious that if you wanted to communicate with other people, you had to be in the same room, more or less. So if communication between minds is the thing that wants to grow to all, right? It wants to be everyone, at least in potential. Okay, I get it. And so the city has been in kind of like dragging bodies along, trying to get minds into connection and having to deal with the fact these minds are connected to bodies. But nowadays, this is no longer, I don't think, a primary constraint, as we see in this call. You and I are not in the same room, and yet we're having a conversation, we're communicating. And it's not bad, right? It's not quite the same as being in the same room, but it's not bad. And I suspect on the one hand, we're getting better at it because we've been forced to by curfew and whatnot. And on the other hand, I think we can continue to get better at it with things like photorealistic immersive VR, for example, creating possibilities of increasing simulation of embodied experience. I'm going to put a flag there, by the way, because that, of course, can be a terrible thing. But we're now walking the razor's edge between terrible things and awesome things. I don't think there's a way for us to step forward without having both sides of the razor's edge in every step. So what we can do now is we can decouple the virtual from the physical. And we can render unto the virtual what is the virtual. And now, of course, be liberated to render into the physical what is physical. And rediscover in the physical what Tyson's been talking about. Right? The more natural, humane, human scale ways of life that are in many ways indigenous. Right? Having really high quality face-to-face interactions at the Dunbar level with other human beings, frankly, who we may spend large amounts of time with, real deep woven communitas. And by the way, with nature, really descaling these massively densified locations that separate us from nature and finding ways to live lightly with nature. And I'm going to flag that as well. This is non-trivial. Well, in fact, if we want to, we can double click on it because it's an interesting point of contention, to be frank. But then you've got a really powerful new combo, right? A situation where there's a virtual, and the virtual Civium is everything, right? So think of it as the thing beyond Facebook and hopefully radically better, right? Designed from the very beginning to actually be healthy. But where everyone, all minds, at least all those who choose to be there, can be. So it truly is a global community of minds. And that's it. Once you've hit that, there is no more to go. Right? All minds, at least in principle, have the possibility of being in connection with each other in a appropriately designed virtual. And then the flip side of the Civium is a global meshwork of holonically nested, so different levels of scale, but really focused on the lowest level of scale, on the level of neighborhoods and villages, of humans living in a very humane, human scale way.